after the headlines.
Tom, thank you. Good morning. It's just gone 9:30. I'm Bethany Elsey in the GB newsroom. Rishi Sunak has launched a fresh attack on his rival Liz Truss, claiming her economic plans would plunge the economy into an inflation spiral. He says Ms Truss can't afford to provide cost of living support, while also keeping her £50 billion tax cut promise, saying it would place public finances in serious jeopardy. But the Foreign Secretary's campaign team says her plans are responsible. Criminal barristers will walk out of courts indefinitely from the 5th of September in a dispute with the government over jobs, pay and legal aid funding. Members of the Criminal Bar Association in England and Wales have voted in favour of strike action with a majority 79%. The Ministry of Justice says more than 6,000 court hearings have already been disrupted as a result of the action. Meanwhile, the second of an 8-day strike at the UK's biggest container port, Felixstowe, has begun. Almost 2,000 members of Unite, including crane drivers and machine operators, walked out yesterday in a dispute over pay. It's the first strike to disrupt the port since 1989. And Pakistan's former Prime Minister Imran Khan is facing a terrorism charge over a political speech he gave at the weekend. He allegedly threatened government officials about the alleged police torture of one of his aides. Hundreds of supporters have gathered outside his mansion in the capital, Islamabad, vowing to prevent his arrest. You're watching GB News on TV, online and DAB+ radio. Now let's get back to Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, first today, almost 2,000 members of the Unite union have started their 8-day strike after rejecting a 7% pay rise offer from the Felixstowe Dock and Railway Company. It's the first dock strike in 30 years and is certain to contribute to supply chain shortages. And on the note of strikes, the Criminal Bar Association have in the last few minutes voted to stage a, quote, indefinite and uninterrupted strike starting next month. The barristers have been offered a 15% fee rise, equivalent to earning £7,000 more every year, but they're rejecting this, demanding 25% instead. Well, over to the leadership campaign, and Rishi Sunak, still struggling in the polls, has come out on the offensive over Liz Truss and her economic plans, slamming what Camp Sunak describes as £50 billion worth of tax cuts. And the former Chancellor's latest high-profile supporter, Michael Gove, is calling the Foreign Secretary's plans a holiday from reality. Over in Labour land, Thagnam Debonair, the shadow leader of the House of Commons, has written to the Prime Minister to implore him to recall Parliament early over the impending energy crisis. Of course, we learn the next price cap rise this very Friday, the 26th of August. Well, so much to get stuck into this morning, and luckily I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Richard Johnson from the Queen Mary University of London. And I suppose the first big question is, we're seeing an almost unprecedented summer of crises. Should Parliament be returning? Should the government be taking this on now, or is it right that basically everything's on hold for another 2 weeks?
You know, when Boris Johnson resigned, there was talk among many commentators, including in academia, that he was a sort of zombie prime minister, that he didn't have the legitimacy to act in any big way, that he shouldn't tie the hands of his successor. Constitutionally, I don't think that's correct. Politically, that might be indeed the case. Part of the problem we have is that this Conservative leadership contest is just going on and on and on. You know, I think it, again, speaks to some of the issues about almost the constitutional issues of having the leader selected by the membership, when you had it selected by the MP, as happened in 1976, when Wilson stood down and Callaghan took over, that can happen in a matter of days, whereas we're talking weeks and weeks and weeks. And in the meantime, the incumbent Prime Minister, sits there in limbo.
I suppose we've only really had 2 moments like this in our political history, in 2019 and in 2022. In 2016, the handover was really rather quick, although David Cameron had planned a long changeover where he'd go around European capitals on a bit of a farewell tour. That was all put to bed by Andrea Leadsom. But I suppose we're learning how to manage this sort of constitutional peculiarity, a sort of half-presidentialised parliamentary system. Is it sustainable?
I've always been very sceptical of it. Another time where it could have happened would have been 2007 when Blair stood down and Brown came in. Now, John McDonnell had sought the leadership against Brown, didn't get enough MPs to back him. If he had, then there would have been weeks of a Labour leadership contest with Brown and McDonnell going after each other, and who knows what might have happened in that contest. I can understand the point. There's an issue here, really, where the MPs seem to favour one candidate and the membership seem to favour another, and members would say, well, then this shows the importance of the members' input. On the other hand, it creates a problem for the sort of strength of the incoming Prime Minister if there's a sense that the incoming Prime Minister lacks the confidence of their own members of Parliament. So I think it throws up all kinds of constitutional problems, and I've argued for many years that there is a strong case, I think, for leaving the selection of the Prime Minister or the party leader in Parliament to the MPs. They know the best.
Really interesting point there. I suppose that would rather undermine the purpose of a mass membership party. Why on earth would you join the Conservative Party if you didn't get to select people like leaders? I suppose you also select your MPs. But really interesting point there. Let's put that on pause while we move on to one of those issues that this lame duck administration has decided to do in its final days. The Prime Minister has approved funding for a new nuclear power station in Suffolk known as Sizewell C, as he enters the final 2 weeks of his premiership. Amid increasing concerns surrounding the energy security of the UK, not least because of Russia's war in Ukraine, Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng has stressed the need to, quote, crack on with more nuclear power stations. But there are reports that the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, is uneasy with such a significant spending decision being taken by Boris Johnson's government just weeks before the next one comes in. There are arguments that it limits the options of the next administration. Well, I'm joined now by Jeremy Nicholson, a specialist in energy markets. And Jeremy, is it the right decision to crack on with this nuclear power station?
I'm afraid it is, and some would say it should have been taken earlier. It's important to realise this isn't the final investment decision, it's just firing the starting gun, if you like. Government is going to commit money, and the private sector is going to have to provide an enormous amount of the 20 billion plus capital required to build it. So the important thing is getting this process going, and I don't think it's unnecessarily going to tie the hands of whoever's in Downing Street in a couple of weeks' time. There's a big political consensus we need to get on with new nuclear, and this is the only shovel-ready project we can get started on.
20 billion capital costs, some of that being met by government, some of that being met by the private sector. I suppose a year or two ago, that would have sounded like an extraordinary amount of money, the kind of money that would make most chancellors' eyes water. But in the context of today, where Sir Keir Starmer has proposed a £60 billion package to help with 6 months of energy costs, where the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, announced a £37 billion spending package to help with what we thought were going to be energy bills half the level than they are now expected to get to. I suppose it all pales in comparison.
Well, you're right. To many of us, it sounds like monopoly money. And of course, this is our money. It's important it's well spent. But one should remember, the reason we need to spend it is to prevent us having the sort of circumstances we're facing now with record high energy prices that are causing fuel poverty in households and damaging our industrial competitiveness. So that's the point of spending it, so we don't get in this situation in future. We've also got the long-term ambition of reducing our carbon emissions to net zero by 2050. That may not seem the immediate problem when we're trying to keep the lights on and pay for our electricity and gas right now, but it's still important. So the new capacity that comes on stream over the next 10 years or so must all be very low carbon, and nuclear is an essential part of that.
But we are closing down a lot of nuclear power stations as things stand. Lots are coming off stream, reaching the end of their useful lives, the ones we built back in the 1970s and so on. Will a new nuclear power station at Sizewell really be adding new energy or just replacing some of that we're losing?
It's mostly the latter, I'm afraid. If the investment decision in the Sizewell and Hinkley before it had happened earlier, maybe we would have been adding to capacity by now. But instead, we're running to stand still, which is all the more reason why we should press on and not delay any further. By the way, this is not about nuclear instead of renewables. This is nuclear plus renewables. Plus, we're going to need gas for a while to come, and we're going to need energy storage and other solutions as well. It's going to be all of the above, I'm afraid.
We hear a lot about small modular reactors, this proposal mainly coming from Rolls-Royce, that we could have smaller, potentially even sort of mass-produced reactors popping up all around the country, potentially much more cheaply and much more quickly than the big Sizewell-style plants. Is this feasible to get done in any short order?
It's feasible. Whether it can be done quickly is another matter. I think the potential's there, as you've said. Building a larger number of smaller units is not only technologically advantageous, it's easier to finance as well. And that, of course, has always been the big issue with nuclear, is paying for it. So, yes, it's the right thing to pursue, and Britain's got great expertise. But right now, the only reactor design that we can build that's licensed for generation in this country is the EPR design already under construction at Hinkley, which can provide, a pair of those reactors, as would be built at Sizewell, could provide 7% of our electricity. So it's a huge plus to have it on the system. But in the future, yes, small modular, it has got to be an interesting way to go. Let's get the costs down the way we have with offshore wind and solar panels by building large amounts of them.
And just very finally in this conversation, this isn't going to do anything to help energy crises this winter, maybe not even next winter. This is all about the medium and long-term energy generation. Is there anything politicians can do to help alleviate this winter?
Well, yes, leaving aside spending huge amounts of consumers' money or taxpayers' money and on the never and adding to our borrowing, the targeted help for those in fuel poverty in the domestic sector, targeted help for trade-exposed energy-intensive industries might be affordable. But above all, what government can do is get out of the way of gas production and some of the rules on electricity backup generation and so on, which constrain what might be available this winter and going into next. So I think there's action on all fronts required by government here.
Well, Jeremy Nicholson, thank you so much for that expert analysis there. Pretty bleak, but some potential beacons of light in the future. Jeremy Nicholson there, specialist in energy markets. Well, let's just catch up with Dr. Richard Johnson now, because there has been some appalling planning decisions from multiple governments dating back decades. Why have the incentives for our politicians been so awry?
Well, some might say that this is inherent in democratic politics to an extent, is that voters, quite rightly, will be judging governments on their current situation. What you need, though, is leadership, and you need politicians to set a long-term vision and plan. This is the kind of thing that a Prime Minister who wins a historic landslide majority ought to be able to do. It feels somewhat odd at the moment that we are talking about a kind of flailing and floundering government when it has this majority that Conservatives haven't seen since the Thatcher period. And part of that was Boris Johnson was thrown off course by COVID, or he had to readjust to it to meet COVID. But the problem really was after COVID, I think this government lost a sense of what its big forward-thinking plan is. And that was not just about addressing the here and now, which is obviously important for a government to do, but actually for Johnson to think about what am I going to use this, once-in-a-generation majority to do for the longer-term good of the country. And I just don't think that thinking has been apparent at all.
Well, let's bring in Tim Montgomery now, who for a time advised Boris Johnson. He's a senior GBNews contributor now and, of course, co-founder of both the Centre for Social Justice and the Conservative Home website. Tim, I suppose this is one of the reasons why Boris Johnson's premiership met an untimely end. It wasn't just the fact that he happened to have a glass of wine in an event for Lee Kane or have some birthday cake in the cabinet room. It was really because a sense of malaise about what his government was, or rather what it wasn't, doing.
Precisely, Tom. And actually, I was speaking to a few Conservative MPs about this very subject the other day. And some viewers perhaps will judge them harshly for what I'm about to say, but their view was that his ethical lapses were real and they shouldn't have been made, and he should have publicly apologised for them. But their view was that his leadership almost certainly would have survived them if the Parliamentary Conservative Party had felt, overall, he was a Prime Minister that was worth keeping in the job because he was building houses, or he was restructuring the state, or he was making reforms of the long-term kind that I think your guest, Richard Johnson, has just been suggesting. And one of those long-term reforms certainly would have been building a diverse range of power stations that could sustain Britain through the coming energy crisis.
It feels like we've spoken about Hinkley C and Sizewell C for years and years and years, and it's only really in the last 2 weeks of Boris Johnson's premiership that there's this sense of urgency to get things done. It is remarkable to see that sort of sense of malaise. The biggest policy proposal of Boris Johnson through his time as Prime Minister were these words, levelling up. And I just get the sense that if you talk to a dozen different Tory MPs about what levelling up actually means in practically policy terms, you'll get at least a dozen different answers.
Yeah, and I'm afraid, Tom, we see the same short-termism in action with levelling up. So, for example, a lot of the parts of the north, I know levelling up doesn't just refer to the north, but a lot of the towns in the north, the red wall seats, they're applying for, leisure centres and various sort of facilities that don't really, will advantage the communities they seek to serve, but aren't really the big developments like major infrastructure projects or major new centres of technology around universities. Those are the lot of long-term projects that would really give the North more of a fighting chance, to keep their young people within their economies. And look, what is it? It's at 2022, 3 years into this Tory majority of 80. Mrs. Thatcher always understood that if you were going to use a big majority, you needed to get underway straight away, because lots of reforms, they're unpopular in the beginning, while the people who are against them are very much voluble. And then they begin to take their advantages as people see what benefits will best be associated with them later on in the Parliament. And the problem is, though, now Liz Truss will inherit that majority of 80, but she has so little time to enact anything meaningful. So she really does have a very difficult inheritance.
I suppose what we've had for the last maybe even 20 years is politicians who just really want to take the easy decisions. It's very hard to make a decision that costs tens of billions of pounds about Northern Powerhouse Rail, or a decision that might upset some marginal constituencies about building new infrastructure, the Oxford-Cambridge Arc, new housing, these big, sizable things that would have a material benefit for our economy. It's much easier to just have a towns fund and spruce up a few city centres, as if that's going to really transform the country.
Completely. And look, one of the things that I like about Liz Truss's bid for the leadership is she wants to revive HS3, which is the link, the Transpennine link. The danger, I think, of HS2 is that it will just really suck even more jobs to London. It will make London easier to get to. It will create only more fuel on the fire that boosts the southeastern economy. The advantage of HS3 is that it connects the parts of the north with each other. But of course, as your question suggests, Tom, the benefits of HS3 won't, accrue for a while. Whereas if you build those swimming pools, or you build a new town centre in a certain northern town or a rural area that hasn't done very well, and you get the immediate electoral hit, but it isn't really building the kind of country, one nation country that we need for the future.
Really sad incentives there. Well, Tim Montgomery, thank you for joining us on the briefing this morning. Interesting stuff, as always. Let's turn back to Dr. Richard Johnson now about exactly what we're going to see from potentially the next administration, because it's looking likely, probably overwhelming, that Liz Truss will become the Prime Minister on the 6th of September. Constitutionally, how quickly can she actually get spades in the ground, get stuff done?
Well, in constitutional terms, Parliament has complete legislative freedom. And so if she really wants to be bold, she can use the unique strength of the British Constitution, which is to legislate however she wishes to legislate, with very few institutional restraints on that. Of course, she has to build a political case for her programme. And I suppose one of the difficulties that she's going to face immediately is that the MPs were not necessarily for her to begin with. Now, she's already building the case, I think, with the MPs to get
she now has
them on her
more
side.
Backers of the party than Rishi Sunak.
Exactly. You're starting to see those MPs switch over to her. That's quite important, and I think it's probably wise of her to be building that case now. But she's going to be facing very difficult, wider economic context. And so the political case is important, but she can't operate independent of what the wider economic context is.
And just finally, it's a big question, but quickly if you could, on the issue of the House of Lords, there is a convention known as the Salisbury-Addison Convention that the Lords allows a government to do what was in its manifesto. If Liz Truss becomes Prime Minister and wants to do things that weren't in the Conservative manifesto of 2019, that could become a significant barrier to progress.
Yes, so the Salisbury Convention is, as you said, is the notion that the House of Lords is not going to act as a block on the government's agenda as put in the manifesto, which is in some ways quite a nice principle because it gives the manifestos that sort of extra power and weight. Ultimately, the House of Lords can only delay because of the Parliament Act, so it can't veto.
But up to 2 years, and there are only 2 years left of this Parliament.
Exactly. Now, there's a nuclear option, which is she can change the composition of the House of Lords, and previous Prime Ministers have threatened to do that. And therefore, perhaps the House of Lords will be aware of that and restrain themselves. I don't think they necessarily want to get into that kind of standoff.
Really interesting stuff there. Well, Richard Johnson, thank you for that expert analysis there. Really interesting constitutional issues going forward. But finally today, the UK will not meet its net zero goals if the next government doesn't make it easier for the public to take up new carbon technologies such as heat pumps or electric vehicles. That's according to new research published by the think tank Onward today. Well, let's speak about it with Alex Luke, senior researcher at Onward. And Alex, in a nutshell, what is your report recommending?
Yeah, good morning, Tom. So this research was really designed to explore what role we as individuals have in the UK's transition to net zero. And what we found is that there's good progress towards decarbonisation to date, but most of that has come from companies. And of the remaining changes that the country needs to make for net zero, about a third of those are responsible for individuals. And clearly the government needs to do more to encourage people to make those changes. But that isn't to downplay people's efforts to cut their carbon footprints or recycle. And it doesn't mean that we need to radically alter how we live our lives. But it does mean that the government needs to do more to encourage people to adopt new technologies, such as heat pumps and electric vehicles. And there is an element of behavioural change underpinning all of this. For example, using more public transport or cycling more. But it isn't about radically changing how we live. And our report, we wanted to develop some practical and fiscally responsible policy ideas that we could give the next PM as food for thought about what they could do to encourage people to make these changes.
And what are these policy proposals specifically? Because I suppose there's a broad spectrum of some what some might describe as more nefarious sort of nudge theory and subsidies on the one hand, versus I suppose you could do a lot with regard to the planning system to make it easier to install electric charging points and the like. There's a broad spectrum, some of it very costly, some of it less so.
Absolutely. And I think what we wanted to do is look at where the key barriers are that people face when they're looking at adopting an electric vehicle or a heat pump. And clearly one of the major ones is the upfront cost. So, for example, one recommendation we had would be a new funding model for energy efficiency and retrofit measures and heat pumps as well, that would use a combination of blended finance, so a proportion of government grants with the remainder funded by subsidised loans over a long payback period. That would really make it affordable for people to install these things now and help cut their bills at a time of crisis, really. And we also looked at some small-scale interventions that the government could make, where we've seen good success in studies carried out here and abroad, that can be done very cheaply but still have a good impact. So schemes to boost the uptake of public transport or active travel, for example.
I remember when the government published its heat pump strategy last year, I think it was. It funded it for 3 years. One of the reasons it funded it for 3 years was because it expected the technology to develop, that in 3 years' time there might be new, better ways of heating homes, potentially less costly ways. If we intervene too much too early on, might that prevent that sort of technological development?
That's right. I think there is definitely a case for careful consideration here. And that's actually one area that the UK has done really well in with electric vehicles. So we saw earlier this year the plug-in car grant finally came to an end. But that's been really successful throughout its lifetime at helping to encourage the sort of early adopters to go out and purchase an electric vehicle, to invest in technology. And we've now seen the price of electric vehicles continue to fall, uptake go well beyond OBR forecasts, and it looks likely that they will reach price parity with petrol vehicles at some point this decade.
Interesting stuff there, Alex, Luke. Well, thank you. We've reached the end of the interview and the end of the programme, but really appreciate your time here on The Briefing this morning. Well, that's it for me today. Coming up, it's To The Point with Alex Phillips. But next, here's the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking rather cloudy with outbreaks of heavy rain moving eastwards across the country. A cloudy picture across southwest England with outbreaks of rain and drizzle. Feeling warm and humid with temperatures of around 20 Celsius. After a sunny morning across southeast England, cloud will begin to spill in from the west by lunchtime, perhaps a few showers arriving too. Wet across southern parts of Wales at midday. Outbreaks of rain could be heavy in places. Poor visibility over the hills and coast too. Cloudy for the Midlands this lunchtime with outbreaks of rain. The rain will be heavy at times with a risk of some surface water flooding places. Feeling humid but warm with light winds. It's a mixed picture this lunchtime across northeast England. Often cloudy with showery rain in places, but a few